afternoon, everyone, and thank you for joining us on what would have been George Washington's 292nd birthday. We're really happy that you're all here for the webinar to mark that occasion and also provide information that's relevant in Black History Month. So I am pleased to introduce Peter Hine, President of the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, which is the owner and operator of the Fraunces Tavern Museum. I recently visited the museum after a long hiatus, and would just like to let you know there have been some wonderful updates, some of which you'll learn about today, as well as hearing about this essential space that has been a witness to so much of our country's history. Peter, in addition to serving as the president of the Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, is also the secretary and a member of the board of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. Professionally, he practiced law as a partner of Wachtell, Lipton, Rosen, and Katz for more than 35 years and currently serves as of counsel to that firm. Mr. Hine grew up in Wisconsin and has resided in Manhattan for more than 50 years. He received his JD degree from Columbia University School of Law in 1975 and his BA degree from the University of Wisconsin in Milwaukee in 1972. So Peter, I'm happy to turn it over to you.
So thank you so much, Pauline, for that introduction. And I want to start with a few words about the colonial origins and the Revolutionary War history of Fraunces Tavern. Pictured here is Fraunces Tavern on a recent Flag Day. Each June, we host a Flag Day parade that begins at City Hall Park, includes many people, including school children. We march down Broadway and then end up in front of Fraunces Tavern where we commemorate that event. You can see the crowd outside the tavern, and we have a massive flag that you can see part of on the left. So some of the highlights on the history of Fraunces Tavern. The building is over 300 years old. It's the oldest surviving building in Manhattan. It was constructed beginning in 1719. It was purchased by our organization, Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, in 1904. We saved it from being demolished. We restored it under the direction of architect William Mercereau to its 18th century appearance. On December 4, 1907, the museum and restaurant opened, and we continue to operate our museum today on the upper floors, and our restaurant, which is operated by a tenant, operates on the lower floors of Fraunces Tavern at 54 Pearl Street, the corner of Broad and Pearl. So the tavern, of course, had colonial origins, having been built in 1719. The land on which the tavern now stands was underwater until the end of the 1600s. And even in that early era, the late 1600s, land in downtown Manhattan was very valued and precious. And so they were filling in the harbor to create more land even then. And to raise funds, the city sold lots created by some of that landfill, part of what was then the Great Dock along Pearl Street. One of those lots was purchased from the city by Stephanus van Cortlandt, and he was someone whose father had immigrated to New Amsterdam, Dutch New York, in 1638. He had a daughter, Anne, who married a merchant, Stephen Delancey, in 1700. Delancey purchased the 54 Pearl Street lot from his father-in-law, and then it was Delancey in the periods beginning 1719 to 1722 who built what he called a large brick house on the property that would eventually become Fraunces Tavern. Some decades later, the firm of Delancey, Robinson and Co., which then included Oliver, Stephen's son, sold the property to or acquired the property. So as part of this colonial heritage, a significant part of Fraunces Tavern survives from those colonial times. And in particular, you can see in the picture the yellow brick facade that faces Broad Street. Many of these original yellow bricks on the Broad Street side are believed to date from the original construction of the tavern back in 1719 as this large brick house. And you can tell if you get up close that many of the yellow bricks are set off in mortar made from local sand and oyster shells. When our organization in the early 1900s restored the building to its 18th century appearance, a company in the Netherlands was selected to manufacture new bricks by hand to match the original yellow bricks on the Broad Street facade. Other elements of that original structure also survive, including much of the first and second floor framing and portions of the red brick facade on the Pearl Street side. So Samuel Fraunces comes on the scene in 1762. Samuel Fraunces purchased 54 Pearl Street from that firm of Delancey, Robinson and Co. And he originally called it the Queen's Head Tavern because this, of course, was before the Revolution. So they were still naming things after the king or the queen. What was remarkable about Samuel Fraunces was that he was innovative. The common tavern of the day provided set meals of a set nature at particular times of the day. It was kind of a common gathering and you ate what was given to you. What was distinct about Fraunces Tavern is he provided and advertised that he provided individual service at any time in the day or in the evening. So that was unique and innovative. The tavern played a role in the revolution from the very outset, going back to 1765, the New York City chapter of Sons of Liberty was formed, and they would meet regularly at the tavern. In the 1774 time period, we have a record of Paul Revere dining with the Sons of Liberty at Fraunces Tavern. And then in May of 1775, the New York Provincial Congress was founded in our long room. And there'll be more later about the long room. This provincial Congress acted as in effect, a temporary government for the colony. And you can see on the left, and this is one of our prized objects, it's 1776 engraving, plan of the city of New York. It's often referred to as a Ratzer map, and it's one of the best depictions of Lower Manhattan and adjacent Brooklyn from that Revolutionary War era. Then, as time went on, of course, after the battles of Lexington and Concord, Samuel Adams and John Hancock were passing through New York on their way to Philadelphia. They ate at Fraunces Tavern in May of 1775. Fraunces Tavern was even caught up in the actual war. In August of 1775, there was an exchange of artillery fire by an artillery company operating out of Lower Manhattan with one of the British battleships. And as a consequence, an 18-pound cannonball went through the roof of Fraunces Tavern. In the spring of 1776, George Washington came down to New York from Boston. The British had left Boston. It was anticipated they would attack in New York. So Washington came down to command the Continental Army, and the Provincial Congress that I mentioned had been formed in the Long Room hosted a banquet in that Long Room in June of 1776 in honor of George Washington and his officers who were there to defend the city. Samuel Fraunces himself was a patriot. When the British occupied New York in September 1776, Samuel Fraunces and his family fled before the British completed the occupation. But a couple of years later, Samuel Fraunces was captured by the British, and he was brought back into the city, and he was forced to cook for the British general, James Robertson, who was then acting as the British governor of New York. Samuel Fraunces, because he was a patriot, used this as an opportunity to spy on the British, and he also would attempt to sneak food to the prisoners in prison ships in New York Harbor. And after the war was over, Fraunces, with the support of George Washington, and you can see the left some of the laudatory remarks from George Washington, was awarded financial support from Congress, attesting to his wartime service. After the war, Washington connected again personally with Fraunces Tavern. On the day the British Army evacuated from New York City, November 25, 1783, Washington, Governor George Clinton, and the Continental Army came down the length of Manhattan. And that evening, Governor Clinton held a banquet at Fraunces Tavern to honor George Washington. And a series of 13 toasts were given that evening at Fraunces Tavern. And these 13 toasts are still given each year by our organization, Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York, at an Evacuation Day dinner that commemorates that event. We have contemporaneous documents on display in our museum that show that the Evacuation Day dinner did occur here at Fraunces Tavern. And in particular, there's a November 27, 1783 article just 2 days after the event from the New York Morning Post. And it recounts how the British Army evacuated. The Americans processed into the city, led by General Washington and Governor Clinton. And then it talks about the dinner at Fraunces Tavern and the 13 toasts, and actually sets out in the article the 13 toasts. So we've got contemporaneous evidence on display. And this is a more legible copy of the 13 toasts. This is from the backside of our menu from a recent Evacuation Day dinner. Washington returned to Fraunces Tavern 10 days later. On December 4, 1783, he invited officers of the Continental Army to join him in our long room to bid them farewell. And this event actually happened in our long room. It's in the same configuration it was the day Washington bade farewell to his officers. And as you know, Washington famously continued on to Annapolis, where he resigned his commission. Each year, we reenact the Washington farewell to his officers in the long room, the very place where it occurred in 1783. This reenactment is open to the public and is typically held on the weekend closest to December 4. So if you go to the Fraunces Tavern Museum website, as you get closer to December 4, you can sign up for tickets to see this reenactment. It's well worth seeing in the room where it occurred. There's contemporaneous documentary proof as well that Washington's farewell did happen in the long room at Fraunces Tavern, namely memoirs from Benjamin Talmage that record the highlights of that farewell. And this is the best known account, and it's used for the reenactment that we present every year. Many other historic events happened at Fraunces Tavern, some of which we are going to cover in subsequent part of this presentation. So the next segment of today's program is about our new permanent exhibit. It's on the Birch Trials at Fraunces Tavern. This exhibit was conceived, spearheaded, researched, and co-curated by Craig Hamilton Weaver, who is the co-chairman of our Museum and Art Committee. Craig was not able to be part of this program today, but we have the co-chairman of the Museum and Art Committee, Ambrose Richardson. He's here to talk about the Birch Trials exhibit that was the culmination of significant research. Ambrose is currently the president of the Lower Manhattan Historical Association. Ambrose was my predecessor as president of Sons of the Revolution in the state of New York. His full bio appears in the materials that were distributed. And Ambrose, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Peter. This is our new exhibit. It is information rich. We always knew that the Birch Trials had taken place at Fraunces Tavern, and we discussed actually having an exhibit so that the museum could represent things that actually occurred there. But I have to give credit to my co-chairman, Craig Weaver, for actually making this happen, taking it beyond the talking stage to the realization. And Craig went so far as to fly to London with Mark Wenger, a historian, to look through the British archives relating to this event. And as a result of that, they came up with information, some of which is quoted in the exhibit itself and others of which underlie it. This exhibit, Peter talked about contemporaneous documentation. This exhibit is almost entirely based on original sources. And there is a write-up that we have internally on this where almost every sentence in this write-up is footnoted with some reference of one kind or another. But first of all, let's talk about what the Birch Trials were and then how they came about, which is a really dramatic story, at least to me, on this. This was the occasion where I guess you would call them loyalists, that former slaves who had come over to the British in response to the British proclamations on the one hand, and slave owners or former slave owners on the other hand, would have a trial before 3 British and 3 American commissioners to confirm or not confirm the emancipation of these slaves or former slaves. In connection with this proceeding, a ledger was maintained, which has become known as the Book of Negroes. There's a copy in England, there's a copy with the archives here. It's been reproduced, in which there are 3,000 names of persons, including their name, their age, their former owners, and the British group or regiment or officer to whom they reported in response to the British proclamations. Of the 3,000 people, between 10 and 20% were already free and they hadn't been slaves, but they chose to leave this country and go mostly to Nova Scotia. Around 50% were women and children. During the trials, the results were mixed. Sometimes the slave owners succeeded, sometimes the former slaves succeeded, and occasionally families were broken up. And one member of the family was permitted to emigrate to Nova Scotia and the others left behind, which is pretty dramatic for them. I mean, what we have said, this the culminating event in one of the largest emancipations that happened there, but we're going to talk about some of the other ones. Can we move on to the next slide? Okay, this is the order that was issued by Oliver Delancey, who was the adjutant general to Samuel Birch. Samuel Birch was the commandant in New York, after whom these proceedings were named, and he was in charge of it. In fact, he was fairly sympathetic to the cause of the blacks seeking to be free. It's a little bit ironic that this is from Oliver Delancey because he used to own Fraunces Tavern. He was one of the people who sold it in 1762 to Samuel Fraunces. And in this, he said that these meetings would be held on a weekly basis at Fraunces Tavern before a commission of British and American officers. And he refers to the location as Fraunces Tavern, which was interesting to me because we had known that it was formerly known as the Queen's Head Tavern, named after Queen Charlotte. But at some point, and we're not exactly sure exactly when, it became known as Fraunces Tavern, which is the name attributed to it here. Can we move up to the next slide, Peter? Okay, now leading up to this, the reason these trials occurred was that in the preliminary articles of peace between Great Britain and as they call themselves, the United States of America, there was a preliminary articles of peace which was agreed to on November 30th. And among these one of November 30th, 1782. And what this said, I mean, if you can read that, there should be a firm and perpetual peace between His Britannic Majesty and said states, between the subjects of one and the citizens of other, wherefore all hostilities both by sea and land shall from henceforth cease. All prisoners on both sides shall be set at liberty, and His Britannic Majesty shall with all convenience speed and without causing any destruction or carrying away any Negroes or other property of the American inhabitants, withdraw all his armies, etc. here. This was approved by the Continental Congress on April 15th. And after that, let's move to the next slide. There was a meeting between George Washington and Guy Carleton. This is, one of the pictures in our collection by John Ward Dunsmore. And of course, I, appreciated it before because they're talking about the evacuation. We previously talked about the evacuation, but the discussion here was the evacuation. And we have reports of this meeting from both sides, the British side and the American side. And what occurred at this meeting is at one point, George Washington said, "What about the Negroes?" And Guy Carleton said, "They're gone." And Washington said, "What do you mean they're gone?" He said they were free, and many of them, thousands of them, have already left. And Washington reportedly was outraged and belligerent and said, "Well, that's not what the treaty says." And Carleton at one point said, that's my interpretation of the treaty, that these people who had come to us in response to our proclamations, before these articles were signed, are free, and we have no right to re-enslave them. At that point, Carleton excused himself, said he was indisposed, and left the meeting. Washington the same day wrote a letter to Carleton saying, "I think this is a complete misrepresentation of the treaty, but I wasn't one of the negotiators. I'm going to refer it to the Continental Congress to see what they have to say about it." Well, the Continental Congress was outraged. I mean, James Madison, of all people, and I say of all people because later he described slavery as evil and America's original sin. But at that point, he said, this is a palpable misconstruction. And they formed a committee, but the committee didn't really do anything about it. A few days later, Carleton formally answered George Washington, setting out his reasons for doing that. He said, "This is a matter of British honor. We promised these people freedom. They relied on it. They came to us. They supported us. And I think it's incumbent on us to give them their freedom. They're not coming back. They have no desire to come back to work as slaves for the Americans. And there's no way to change that. What we can do, however, is we can set up a commission to see that people qualify under the standards that I have set up or not, of both American and British representatives, and keep a record of the people who go through this process and are allowed to go to Nova Scotia, and the Americans can claim compensation later from this list, which will be accurate enough to describe the people who are leaving. And at this point, Washington wasn't in the strongest position. First of all, he's supposed to keep the peace. Secondly, he wants the British to go. The British have more soldiers here than the Americans do. Washington had just barely survived a near mutiny of his own officers in March, which was known as the Newburgh Conspiracy. He was having mutinies in various places around the country. And he wrote to some of the slaveholders who'd been imploring him to get back their slaves and said, "I don't think they're coming back." And he didn't make anything of his own slaves, a couple of whom did become free by this process, but he did not make an issue of it personally. Can we go to the next slide? Okay, this is a copy of a couple of the certificates that were given, the signed ostensibly by or on behalf of General Birch. A lot of the people who came through the process had certificates already signed by British officers saying that they had come to us on such and such a time. And they were kind of waved through the process, which is, we have records of about 20 trials. There were probably more, somewhat more than that, but many of the people already had their credentials. But what they say is these people have leave to go to Nova Scotia or wherever they want to go. Mostly they went to Nova Scotia. There's a place in Nova Scotia then, was formed then, and it's called now Birchtown, named after Samuel Birch, for people, I think, in gratitude of the freedom that they gained at this point. Can we move back? Okay, so how this came about, how this all came about, backing up, going through history backwards. Back in November of 1775, Lord Dunmore, who was the British governor of Virginia, declared that if slaves came over to their side and fought for the British, they would be free. Of course, the slave owners were somewhat outraged at this. Some of the Negroes or blacks took part in the Battle of Great Bridge, which didn't work out particularly well for them because it was, they were crossing a bridge against cannon fire. That was sort of known as Virginia's Bunker Hill. But this sort of started the process of recruiting the slaves to go for the British side. And this was not out of any feeling of magnanimity or, opposition to slavery. It was purely a cynical move to deprive the Americans of the ability to use their slaves and so forth. Can we get to the next slide? Okay, and there was reciprocal action on the American side here. It wasn't only the British who were recruiting black soldiers. I mean, Washington, at the end of 1775, when a lot of enlistments were ending, had noticed that we have a number of black soldiers here. Congress said, no way, we're not having any black soldiers. Washington later said, maybe we ought to reconsider, and Congress said, well, if they've already fought for us, they can still fight for us. It isn't clear that anybody paid any attention to this restriction. We're talking about 20% of the population here, and both sides are competing for the services of this group. Can we go on to the next slide? Okay, now the Phillipsburg Proclamation was issued in June 30th, 1779. I think we have another page where this is made more legible. But anyway, it says, the Phillipsburg Proclamation was issued by Henry Clinton. And it said, whereas the Americans are recruiting blacks to fight for them, we need blacks to work for us. And whereas Dunmore restricted the offer of freedom to people who fought, Clinton put it for any capacity. If the black service in any capacity, they will be granted their freedom to be with us. And in fact, throughout the war, the Americans made more use of blacks as soldiers than the British, who didn't really trust them to perform and mostly used them for menial tasks. But a number of the blacks, free and enslaved, particularly the ones from Rhode Island who became notable there, looked forward to obtaining for themselves and their families and their descendants what the Americans were seeking in that war. And later it turned out they had no interest to go to Africa or to Europe, maybe to Canada, but they wanted to be Americans and they wanted to have the rights that Americans did. Well, this is the one that says, whereas the enemy have adopted a practice of enrolling Negroes among their troops. So we got to at least respond in kind and recruit Negroes for us, and said in any occupation which they shall think proper. We go to the next slide. Now this, goes back. I mean, we have examples here that this process of competing for the services of the black members of the population, went back to 1770 with the Boston Massacre. Crispus Attucks is the first victim of this revolution. There are pictures of Peter Salem, from John Trumbull at Bunker Hill. There are a lot of documented records of black soldiers for both the Continental Army and in the militia, but primarily the Continental Army. In fact, by the time of Yorktown, according to the French, a quarter of the Continental Army consisted of black troops. Partly because they had no place to go. They were there for the duration. A lot of the other troops came and went. The blacks, for the most part, stayed. Now, the Daughters of the American Revolution had done a study of black soldiers for the American cause, and they came up with about 5,000 names from the pension list. But of course, to be eligible for a pension, if you were an enlisted man, you had to be have survived 40 years. This didn't occur until 1817, so you had to have survived 40 years and be destitute. So that left out a lot of people. So this 5,000 number is probably way too small for the people who did this. And of course, on the American side, this was, an integrated army for the last time until the Korean War. And of course, we have black members in our organization who, want us and insisted that we tell their part of the story too, as well as the loyalist part of the story. We get to the next slide. This is a citation we got. The Mayor Adams gave us a citation. It's a little bit small to read. We were very pleased by the turnout for the opening of this exhibit. Representatives from the Schaumburg Center came, and a lot of the Black DAR members came, and our members and whatnot, to see this, because they date their ancestry, or their ancestry includes patriots here. But we've since had a presentation by someone from Nova Scotia to tell us some of the history up there. And I've met some of the descendants of loyalists who did go to Nova Scotia at some of the various events and meetings that we've had. And it's another side of the story. Of course, what happened in Nova Scotia is yet another event, which we may cover as part of this exhibit in the future, but maybe not. We get the next slide. Okay, here is Lori Cumbo, who is, wow. I mean, she's a ball of fire. Anyway, she was there at the exhibit. And of course, as many people do, they said, gee, I didn't realize all the stuff that was going on here. We have here, of course, Peter and Lori. We have Scott Dwyer, our executive director. I'm there, and Craig Weaver is there. He's the proud, parent of this exhibit. So we're proud of what we've done here. Our plan is to expand it a little bit and make it more accessible, because there's so much information here, and it's such a big story. We've started thinking, well, this is kind of a sideshow. No, it's not. It's a culmination of a much larger story, which we're trying to tell at this place. So we got on. I think this is kind of the Lori with the exhibit here. We're on to the next one. Let me introduce, to you, Renee Witterstetter, who is the non-member member of our museum committee and has been invaluable. Renee is, boy, a lot of things, but an illustrator, an editor. She has brought to us an incredible exhibit, among other things, to our organization, and I'm happy to turn it over to one of our most valuable players in our museum committee, Renee.
Thank you, Ambrose. I'm very happy to be here and in honor of this day and talking about our museum. I never tire of hearing about Samuel Fraunces, who to me was the P.T. Barnum of his day. He's a fascinating character. And of course, the Birch Trials, which is such an important event that happened in our walls. And it's as we delve more into the subject and expand our exhibit on the Birch Trials, it's interesting to put into perspective Washington's role and how he was directed to act in certain ways, even while his views and the founding fathers' views on slavery were changing. So, this is something that we will look at further and expand, and we hope we invite all of you out there to come and see Fraunces Tavern and experience what we have there. I know that we brought Craig Weaver's name up a lot, but I also have to give a shout out to Craig, because without him, my exhibit would not have happened. Craig is the one who first recruited me to come to Fraunces Tavern and to be a member of the Museum and Art Committee. And as the first woman, I've been completely honored and happy to take on that role. So one of the first things that I wanted to do when I came to the museum, I've always had a love of history. And of course, I was a comic book editor for many years. I'm a talent agent now for artists and actors and voice actors through my companies. But one of the first things I thought about when I came to the museum is, how can I combine my love of history with my knowledge of comic books? So if you go to the next slide, this will give you just a little view of what the final product looks like. Of course, we're taking 4 walls in our largest exhibit room at Fraunces Tavern right now for this. And it's called Cloaked Crusader, George Washington in Comics and Pop Culture. So what I wanted to do is look at 100 years of pop culture history and see how George Washington was intertwined in that. Because in my viewpoint, when you think about George Washington and what he was able to do during the Revolution and how he did it, and how he was able to take all these diverse people from diverse regions with diverse goals and make them somehow work together to accomplish what he did, was kind of miraculous. It was almost like a superpower. But also when you think about the fact that at the culmination of all of this, that he was offered absolute power and he turned it down. You know, in every comic book that you read, what does the supervillain want? They want absolute power. So, you know, I propose in this exhibit then that in many ways, George Washington was our first superhero. And if you look at the next slide, this just shows you just a fraction of the books that we uncovered. Because when I started delving into this subject, I thought, oh, you know, I may find maybe a few hundred examples of George Washington in comic books, but there are thousands. And I'm still finding new ones every day. And he's still showing up in current magazines and other pop culture references. So I am constantly adding to this exhibit. It's like a living exhibit, really. And you know, the more I uncover, the more interesting it is. And in fact, I just wrote a book on the subject too, which is also for sale in our bookshop by the same name, where we look at some of these examples of Washington in pop culture. But if you look at the next slide, I wanted to start the exhibit talking about just what exactly is pop culture. You know, if you look at any definition of pop culture, it's basically things that unite a certain society and remind them what their common goals are, what their feelings are, what their rules of engagement are. It's a shorthand for who we are as a people. And if you look very early on at pop culture in the United States, George Washington was right there. You know, if a tavern put out a sign with Washington on it, what did that tell you? It immediately told you what that tavern owner thought, what was important to them, who they supported. And you knew that inside that tavern, you might find people that were like-minded. In its own way, that was a type of pop culture. This is the piece you're looking at here is a lovely piece by Leyendecker. It's very idolized. I'm not sure Washington ever had a saddle like that, but if he didn't, he should have. But Leyendecker used Washington as a subject for his Saturday Evening Post covers 5 times. That was just a testament to, if you put Washington on a cover, it was going to sell. People wanted to see that. So pop culture, Washington in our pop culture was infused over many different magazines over time. And if you think about it, if you don't know, it's a very interesting subject. the World's Fair in New York that happened in the 1930s was completely Washington centric. All the souvenirs bore the likeness of Washington. It was the anniversary of his inauguration, I believe. And there was a big statue of him in Flushing, and it's like they recreated a mini Mount Vernon. So that's a part of history that many people have forgotten about. And also an exhibit that I would love to do someday, talking about the World's Fair, because it was a fascinating thing. The first time that one of our presidents actually gave a televised address. So, you know, but Washington was there. So if you, it was started out in the next slide. If you take a look at the next slide, the slide on the right shows you an example of how his comic book presence first started. And we are talking about 100 years ago. The nice thing about our exhibit when it opened in 22 was that it was the 100th anniversary of the first monthly comic book. So it was very timely. But when Washington's appearances first started in comic books, of course, people were talking about what they knew. So there were historical representations of different events in Washington's life. There were retellings of crossing the Delaware, retellings of Valley Forge. This one is talking about the mapping out of Washington, D.C. This is by an artist named George Evans, who was one of the most popular illustrators of his day. So people did start doing mini stories just chronicling the exploits of Washington and our founding fathers, and different things about the history of the United States. But from there, after a while, that wasn't enough. People started wanting to do fantasy stories. They started wanting to talk about what would it be like if we could travel back in time to actually meet Washington, or if we could, you know, bring him to the present, what would that be like? Maybe this was spurred on by, you know, novels like The Time Machine. You know, what if you could do this? So it was just such a creative, just a creative pool that people could draw from. If you look at our next slide, you know, this is just a few of the examples. Both Marvel and DC Comics were getting in on the Washington time travel. The one that you see on the left is Supergirl. And Supergirl goes back into time at one point, and the original flag in the story, the Betsy Ross flag, is destroyed, and somehow she helps repair that flag and get it back to Washington before anybody knows about it. So she's instrumental in the creation of our first flag. And then on the right side is a story with the Fantastic Four from Marvel, where Mr. Fantastic and Johnny Storm, the Human Torch, go back into time and actually spring Washington from jail. Apparently, in this story, he was captured by the British, and only the Fantastic Four could come and save him. So there's so many stories out there, and the writers were so creative. If you look at the next slide, it's Superman helping Washington cross the Delaware. This happens a lot. I think probably the cameos of most superheroes happen either when Washington is crossing the Delaware and they somehow aid him, or they somehow help him at Valley Forge. I think, though, that probably crossing the Delaware is probably the most popular plot device that is used in these stories. And, you know, you might wonder, like, why did DC Comics really picked up on the time travel stuff? Of course, it started before then. You had books like Hit Comics, where Kid Eternity would go back in time and enlist Washington's aid to come to modern days and fight mobsters in Chicago. But DC Comics really started picking up on the time travel stories and including Washington quite often. And I propose in the exhibit that if you look back to who the creators were at DC Comics at the time, a lot of them were children of immigrants. A lot of them were of Jewish descent. A lot of them came here after World War II, looking for a new life, looking for a new home, looking for a new country, new opportunities. So I think in a lot of ways, their own journey, their own family stories, maybe somehow resonated with the revolution, when we also were trying to find our own way and forge a new path. So these stories are abundantly patriotic, and talking about the United States and about being a hero in the way that you yourself can be a hero. If we look at the next slide, I wanted to show this particular comic book cover back when comics were 10 cents. Believe me, they cost a lot more now. But this book in particular, and a conversation that I had with one of the artists I represent, Michael Golden, is what really was the germination, the little seed that was planted for this exhibit. If you know the history of Batman, the comic book character, his ancestor, which they clearly state in the stories, was Anthony Wayne, who of course was a real person. So I started thinking, well, okay, so Batman has a connection to the Revolutionary War. I wonder how many other connections there are in comic books to the Revolutionary War. And of course, since Fraunces Tavern has ties to Washington, and Hamilton and Burr dying there a week before their duel, and Fraunces Tavern has ties to many other people, I started looking in the books for Revolutionary War connections, but predominantly the person that kept coming up over and over again was, of course, Washington. So that became the focus of a year and a half to almost 2 years of research. And as I said, my research is continuing, it's ongoing, and it's nice too to find these old artifacts like this 10-cent comic book and save them, because as you know, a lot of the older publications from before World War II were destroyed during the paper drives. So books that are older than that are becoming increasingly hard to find. So if we look at the next slide, it wasn't just Marvel and DC that were getting in on time travel. Archie Comics was doing it too. The only difference was, like with Superman or Kid Eternity would just say the name of the person he wanted to meet, and he could go back into time. I think that'd be a really cool power to have. Superman and Supergirl could just zoom back through time really quickly with their super speed and end up wherever they wanted. But in the Archie books, they had to come up with some other way, and most often they were hit on the head and just woke up in the past. Not exactly as exciting, but that's the way they did it. One of the things we do with the exhibit is I also want to make it very interactive for children. So we have kids corners throughout the exhibit where we ask children a question. And one of the questions is, if you found yourself back in time, what would you do to convince George Washington that you were from the future? And one of the things that they did in the comic book was Jughead shows General Washington a $1 bill that he happened to have in his pocket. Says, "Hey, I'm from the future. You're on all of our money." So I also, we try to get the children to think and engage them in history. So the exhibit is many-fold. It's a lot of fun for adults. It's a lot of fun for kids too. We have school groups coming that seem very engaged in it. And one of the things I'm working on now is a scavenger hunt that also goes along with the exhibit. But to move on, also on the right side of your panel, you'll see something from a Dale comic book. So, we even have a Star Trek getting involved. In this particular story, Captain Kirk and the crew end up on a planet that is populated by historical figures, and Washington being one of them. And it's a wonderful story. We talk more about it in the exhibit, about talking about what it is that makes a person who they are and how that is important. So that's, I won't go too much into that right now, but let's look at the next slide. Now, one whole wall in our exhibit is devoted to the bicentennial, because of course, during the bicentennial, there was this wealth of information that came out about American history and superheroes getting involved in that. Marvel and DC, of course, were the forerunners. On your left, you'll see one of the panels from the Marvel bicentennial calendar, of course, Washington crossing the Delaware again, but with all the Marvel superheroes this time. And then on the right, you will see one of DC's offerings, which was called The Spirit of 1776, and Superman acting as the narrator as he goes back and talks about some of the characters at DC Comics, like Tomahawk, who engaged with Washington a lot in that comic book series. The bicentennial was, like I said, a wealth of publications. Every company out there, from Dell to Archie to Marvel, DC was involved in it. It's an interesting look at how each company approached the subject matter. If you look at our next slide, it's still happening. Like I said, there are new books coming out all the time with Washington as a co-star. And very timely. Here's a panel from Barbie on our left. Of course, she's having quite a debut with her movie right now. But we were doing the Barbie comic book quite a long time before that at Marvel Comics. And this is one example of one of her pages here. And then on the right, of course, this is a very recent book that only came out a few years ago, with Bugs Bunny getting into the act. So like I said, he is still continuing to make a lot of guest appearances in books out there. That's why the exhibit is going to continue to grow as I continue to find more assets. And finally, if you look at the next panel, I wanted to show you a few more examples of what we have in the exhibit. You'll notice some pedestals in the middle of the room. We do have some artifacts from the New York World's Fair that occurred in the 1930s that I mentioned. We do have other toys and pop culture items that feature Washington, including in one of the panels you'll see some historical plates from the 1930s that I call storytelling plates. They're transferware. But it's a set of 12, and I have some of them on display. You can see the whole set at Mount Vernon on display right now. But it's important scenes in George Washington's life. Because one of the things that I'm trying to also bring out in the museum is that, in the exhibit, is that there was a time in our country when there was a portrait of Washington in every household. He was right there with the portraits of your grandfather and your favorite aunt. He was right there in a place of prominence with the people that made you who you are. And this exhibit is pointing out that he is still there in different forms and in different ways. And that is the fabric of pop culture, because I think he and many of other of our historical figures, our founding fathers, who started this great experiment, their spirit is still there in many ways, and Washington's image and his visage is still one of the most recognized in the world. If you look at the panel on the upper right, it's hard to see it here, but I hope you will come to the museum and see it in person. There is a portrait of Washington in the very middle by Daniel Scott Jr., and it's made entirely of candy wrappers. So it's a mosaic of pop pop wrappers and other kinds of candy wrappers. So it is a very unique piece. And we also have a video there that shows you how it was created. Other original art you can see in the exhibit includes pieces by Michael Golden and Arthur Sudam, renowned comic book artists, George Perez. So anyone interested in art, interested in valuable and vintage books, and other vintage porcelain, there's something for everybody here. And the exhibit does tell the story. As you walk around the room, it tells the story of the sequential art, George Washington. If you go to my last panel here, this is the piece I was talking about. One of the pieces, this one is by Arthur Sudam. The first slide that we showed you was one of the pieces by Michael Golden. But I particularly also love this piece. We entitled it Through His Eyes, and each image of Washington has a different version of our flag in the sunglasses. So it's like taking Washington through the years, through the decades, through the events, starting from the original flag to the 76th flag to the flag from Iwo Jima to our current flag. And it's just, once again, the theme of the exhibit is that he is still there in our pop culture. And there's many other things that we talk about in the exhibition, how he was brought up during the war as an icon to spur, different drives for money, different, enlistment goals. So he's been out there, and we've provided a lot of artifacts from all these different things for people to look at. And it's what I love about it too. And I'll just end on this, is that it was really a fun and rewarding experience to create this exhibition and welcome the sequential George Washington. Sequential means, comic book. The sequential art George Washington back to a home, to a place that he actually occupied in life. So once again, please do come out to the museum and see it for yourself, and experience all the other new exhibits that we have been able to put together in the last 2 years, that have totally revitalized the whole museum, thanks to people like Craig Weaver, and thanks to the rest of the Museum and Arts Committee that I have had such an honor working with. Thank you, guys.
Thank you, Renee. And I'm just going to take a minute to just give you a very brief overview of the other exhibits. This is the long room. You can come and stand in the long room. This is the Washington Portrait Gallery, which includes some items from the last quarter of the 18th century. This is an exhibit that commemorates the fact that Congress, while the Capitol was in New York, rented Fraunces Tavern for, in effect, the first government office building at Fraunces Tavern. And this is showing how the office of the Department of Foreign Affairs may have looked at the time. We have an exhibit on the private dining at Fraunces Tavern. We have our flag gallery displaying regimental flags, and a rotating selection of our 50 Dunsmore paintings along the walls. We have the Loeb Gallery with special exhibits. In June, we're going to open an exhibit commemorating Lafayette's 200th anniversary of Lafayette's return to America. We have an exhibit that tells the story of the history of Fraunces Tavern, including a model of 54 Pearl and the other historic buildings on the block. We have a history of the Sons exhibit, which includes a number of paintings and other artifacts of interest, including we even have a lock of George Washington's hair and one of his teeth. We have a gallery with Zabritsky Gallery with some society artifacts. And we do lecture programs. So if you go to the Fraunces Tavern Museum website, you can sign up to get emails alerting you to our programs. The restaurant, of course, continues to operate a restaurant business the way Samuel Fraunces did in the 1760s and 1770s. So
I'm
thank you very
afraid we
much.
have to end. I'm afraid, Peter, we need to end there. It is actually 2:00. The information was fabulously interesting. I think people understand why visiting the museum is a worthwhile thing to do, and fun and entertaining and educational all at the same time. Really appreciate people joining the presentation. The webinar will be available on our YouTube channel. So thank you again. And the address of the museum is, go back to Peter.
54 Pearl Street, Broad and Pearl.
Okay. All right. Thank you all.
Thank you, Paul.